So before I start, I just want to thank everyone for coming, thank the judges, and a special thanks to whoever brought the cookies. Now, when you imagine a sexual predator, you probably don't think of a 10-year-old child. But the law disagrees with you. As Human Rights Watch documented in 2007, it is now a regular thing. Children as young as 10 years old are forced to register as sex offenders. Now, the father of one particular offender, he told Human Rights Watch in an interview, "My child doesn't even know what sex is. It's hard to explain to him why he has to register as a sex offender." And that child, that 10-year-old child, will be required to register as a sex offender for the next 25 years. And though lawmakers surely never had a 10-year-old in mind when they made these laws, when the public surely never had a 10-year-old in mind when they thought of a sex predator, if you Google this kid's name in 15 years, in 20 years, it'll pop up on a sex offender registry, indistinguishable from any other sex offender, and the crime listed will be child molestation. Now, nowhere on that report will it explain that this kid was just 10 years old. And this is hardly an isolated case. In our law, though it typically distinguishes between juvenile offenders and adult offenders, it makes no such distinction for sex crimes. These laws that were crafted to protect children from sexual predators have themselves become predatory towards children. And that's why I stand before you today and advocate that the U.S. federal government abolish the juvenile registration of sex offenders. Because though we distinguish between juveniles and adults in all other settings, we don't make this distinction for minors. And that results in unnecessary and preventable harm, both to these kids, their families, and society as a whole. And that needs to change. So how did we get here? Well, there's a saying in Washington that no good deed goes unpunished, that the best of intentions can sometimes create the worst of laws. And that's exactly what's happened. As the National Conference of State Legislatures explained in 2012, the Adam Walsh Act, passed in 2006, requires states to register juveniles as sex offenders or otherwise lose funding for certain Justice Department programs. Many states have complied because the money forces them to, though some states have not. This law was passed for a simple reason: because of a well-documented tragedy in which a child was murdered, brutally raped and murdered by a former sex offender. Now, unfortunately, though this law had the best of intentions, it's had the unfortunate result of punishing kids with the long time and sometimes lifelong stigma of sex offender registration. As Human Rights Watch reported in 2007, the sort of crimes that can get kids onto sex offender registries don't even have to be violent. They can include benign acts like public urination, sexting, or even consensual sex between teenagers. That's resulted in bizarre incidents like Melinda Miller, a 15-year-old in Pennsylvania, who faces charges for trafficking child pornography. She faces these charges because a principal found pictures in the nude on another person's phone while at her middle school. Or it results in other bizarre incidents, like one individual who was interviewed by Human Rights Watch, who was convicted of statutory rape at the age of 16. The victim, who was 14 at the time, is now his wife. When Human Rights Watch interviewed him, he said, "Do you think I'm a threat to public safety? Because my wife doesn't think so." Now, it's also important to realize that juvenile offenders are distinct from their adult counterparts, and they are so in two ways. the Center on Sex Offender Management explains that, for one thing, juveniles are developmentally distinct from their adult counterparts. They're not nearly as mature, cognitively or emotionally, and for that reason, they're much more likely to respond to treatment than adult offenders. And the second distinction between juvenile offenders and adult offenders is that these juvenile offenders are often victims themselves. About 50% of them live in households where they experience physical abuse. As many as 80% live in households where they experience sexual abuse. The overwhelming majority of these juvenile offenders suffer from psychiatric problems like depression or impulse control issues. They often live in families that are unstable or neglectful. These are kids who deserve our support, not our stigma. And yet stigma is exactly what the law has imposed on these kids. And that's resulted in harms to these individuals, their families, and society as a whole. Now, John Tewksbury of the University of Kentucky explains some of the legal consequences of this juvenile sex offender registration. Juveniles who are forced to register as sex offenders face the same restrictions on where they can live, where they can work, where they can go to school as do adults. That can result in the nonsensical outcome that a juvenile will be evicted from his or her home, from his or her family, because the house in which they live is too close to one of these restricted areas. But there are also the social consequences of this registration. Phoebe Deere of the University of Virginia explains that when your name is put out there, when your community is notified that you committed such a crime, even if you're at a young age, that results in a lot of social damage, neglect from your peers, bullying, and that can result in depression. It can result in lifelong psychological problems. In short, our law forces these individuals, it pushes them to the fringes of society. Rather than focusing on rehabilitation, we punish these kids, sometimes for life. But the kids aren't the only people affected by these laws. Their families are also affected. A study called The Collateral Damages of Sex Offender Registration looked at the parents of these juvenile sex offenders and their siblings and found that they too suffered from this stigma. They too often lost friends or became socially isolated because friends of theirs knew that their child committed these crimes. Now, Human Rights Watch explained that in other ways, the law never allows families to move on from these crimes. One individual interviewed by Human Rights Watch explained how whenever his family wants to go on vacation, he has to look up the sex offender laws in that state. And he has to tell his parents whether or not they can go to that state, whether or not if they stay there for a certain amount of time, he'll have to check in with the police department in that state. He's required to do that. The law doesn't allow these people to forget, to move on, to heal. And that actually results in harms to society. Elizabeth Letourneau, she's a professor at the University of South Carolina, and she looked at states which require juveniles to register as sex offenders and states which do not make this requirement. And she found, interestingly enough, that offenders who are required to register are actually more likely to reoffend than offenders who are not required to register. And the reason for this is understandable. When a kid is allowed to go back to school, to build healthy relationships, to receive treatment, he gets better. But when a kid is pushed to the fringe of society, to the margins, to the outcast, when everything is taken away from him or her, it's difficult to rehabilitate. And unfortunately, our law has for too long pushed children in that direction. And that's critical, because if our law is hurting these kids, it's hurting their families, but on top of all of that, it's not even reducing crime. It's a no-win situation, and it needs to change. That's why I propose that the US federal government abolish juvenile sex offender registration and replace it with a system of rehabilitation. I'm not saying that these minors shouldn't be punished for their crimes. Obviously they should. But I am saying that the law has gone too far, and that rather than punishing these kids with lifelong stigma, they should be required to receive treatment. Now, a meta-analysis in the Journal of Sex Abuse found that offenders who receive treatment are less than half as likely to reoffend as offenders who do not. These kids need to be given the help they need. They need to be given the help they deserve. What they don't need is the scarlet letter of lifelong stigma. Now, it's not easy to stand before you and say that the punishment for sex crimes should be reduced, but it's the right thing to do for these kids. It's the right thing to do because these laws have themselves become predatory against children. And it's time that the law recognized that children are not miniature adults, and they should not be treated that way. Thank you.